Welcome, everyone, to our Thursday afternoon lecture series on careers, practical politics, and I don't think we have any logistical things, right, Kelly? Okay, good. So welcome out, and happy to have everybody on this kind of rainy, cold, snowy day. We have today with us Judge Tom Griffith, who is a federal judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, which is marvelous to be able to have him here, and a real treat for us. Judge Griffith was appointed to the United States Court of Appeals in June 2005. He graduated from BYU in 1978 and from the University of Virginia School of Law in 1985. Judge Griffith was engaged in private practice for as little time as possible, as I recall, from 1985 through 1995, and in 1999 and 2000 in North Carolina and Washington, D.C. From 1995 through 99, Judge Griffith was Senate Legal Counsel of the United States, the Chief Legal Officer of the United States Senate. So 1995 to 1999. Seems like the Senate was doing some pretty interesting stuff in that era, if you recall, and maybe Judge Griffith will talk about that a little bit today. I think it had to do with an impeachment proceeding or something like that. Judge Griffith also served as the General Counsel to the Advisory Commission on Electronic Commerce, as Assistant to the President and General Counsel of BYU in Provo, and as a member of the Executive Committee of the American Bar Association's Central European and Eurasian Law Initiative. So lots of interest, lots of background, and we're pleased to welcome him here today. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Darren. It's nice to be here. I love BYU and accept any invitation to speak at BYU, almost any invitation. So I did this last year, and I have the same notes from last year. So I have no new material, no new jokes. As you see, I don't have many jokes. But what I'd like to do this year, maybe a little bit different, is I'd like to reserve as much time as possible for questions that you might have. And so what I'll do, first of all, I'll tell you a little bit about the court that I'm on, the work that we do. I'll just touch on briefly my career and how I got to where I am. Then I would like to reserve the right to give you some advice at the end. The gray hair in me, the former stake president in me, desires to speak out and to give you some advice. But so I'll reserve some time at the end of that. But I really am anxious to have you direct as many questions my way as possible, so I'll try and reserve as much time for that as possible. First of all, about my court, to give you a little primer, and maybe you already know this on our federal court system. As you may know, there are three levels of courts, generally three levels of courts in our federal court system. The trial court level are called district courts, and there are hundreds of those around the country, and that's where the trials take place. That's where the cross-examination of witnesses and speaking to juries, all the exciting stuff that one might want to watch on TV occurs. That's not what I do. There are 12 regional courts of appeals around the United States, and I sit on one of those. We hear appeals of decisions that are made by the district courts. And the court that I sit on is the smallest geographically. It just covers Washington, D.C., the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. The other circuits are quite large. The Ninth Circuit that sits in San Francisco takes in most of the western part of the United States, as well as Hawaii and Alaska. We don't. Ours is just Washington, D.C., quite small in that regard. No member of my court would feel comfortable with the descriptions that the media often uses of the D.C. Circuit, but sometimes in the media it's referred to as the second most important court in the land. I have no idea what that means. None of us have any idea what that means, but our parents like to say that about us. We do have a rather interesting history being in Washington. We hear some interesting cases involving the separation of the powers when the executive branch and the legislative branch do conflict in court. Sometimes it's in front of us. The Watergate litigation was in front of us. The Pentagon Papers case was in front of us. The Microsoft antitrust case was in front of us. Right now, we have a fairly large docket of appeals of the Guantanamo cases. So simply by virtue of the fact that we're in Washington, D.C., we get a number of interesting cases. We also have, and this we are proud to talk about, a number of distinguished alumni of our court. For example, today on the United States Supreme Court, 4 of the 9 members were formerly members of our court. The Chief Justice was from the D.C. Circuit, as were Justices Scalia, Ginsburg, and Thomas, and so we're very proud of that. Our docket tends to reflect where we're from. I think someone has done the numbers. I don't follow them that carefully, but I've been told that 2/3 to 3/4 of the cases that we hear involve the United States as a party in one form or another. Most of our cases seem to be challenges that are brought in court to actions by various agencies of the federal government, the EPA, the Food and Drug Administration, these sorts of entities. Challenges to their actions often find their way in front of us. The way that we spend our time, it's a job that if you like reading and you like writing, you'll love it, because that's what we spend most of our time doing, reading and writing. If you are an extrovert and enjoy interaction with a lot of different people, you'd be sadly disappointed by that. I happen to be an extrovert, and so therefore I accept invitations to come out and meet people and to speak. I like this a great deal. But most of my time is spent reading by myself and then writing. Fortunately, each federal appeals court judge is allowed to hire law clerks to assist in the process. I have 4 remarkable clerks who help me in my preparation and my writing. But for example, in a typical month, I will sit and we always hear cases with at least 2 other judges. And 4 days of a typical month, I will sit and hear cases in the morning. And those will be typically 3 cases, so 12 to 15 cases a month I'll hear. And the rest of my time will be spent preparing for those cases, or after those cases are heard, and if I have given an assignment to write an opinion on one of them, we'll be writing about those. But a lot of time preparation in advance for hearing the cases, a lot of time afterwards writing. I've heard Justice Scalia say that he typically has 5 drafts of opinions that he writes. Chief Judge Kaczynski of the Ninth Circuit, the rumor is that he goes through about 60 drafts of opinions, and I'm somewhere in between, a lot more closer to Justice Scalia on that one. But we spent a lot of time reworking our opinions, and so if you like to read and to write, it's a great place to be. Quickly about my career up to this point in time, and I'll warn you, a number of years ago, a mentor of mine commenting on my career said, "Tom, you'll have to admit that your resume has a certain staccato quality about it." And that's true. I've been a federal appeals court judge now since July of 2005. That's 6.5 years. That's the longest by a significant margin that I've ever had a single job since graduating from college. Most of my jobs, as you'll hear, were just for a couple of years, and then I moved on to something else. I'm not commending that to you as a good way to do it, but it's the way that I've done it. I attended BYU as an undergraduate and studied humanities with an emphasis in comparative literature. Then I started law school at the University of Virginia, and then quit before the completion of the first semester. Was employed by the church educational system, where I worked in seminaries and institutes for about 3 years, and then quit. And maybe I started using the word quit and moved on. And then went back to law school at the University of Virginia, and this time completed law school. Upon graduation from law school, I worked at a law firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I did primarily litigation. Did that for about 4 years and then left. Moved back to Washington, D.C., where my wife and I are from, and worked at a law firm there, became a partner at a law firm there, was there about 5 years or so, and then left to become, as Professor Hawkins mentioned, the chief legal officer of the United States Senate, Senate Legal Counsel. Did that job for 4 years and then left and went back to my old law firm where I was a partner, was there for about 1.5 years, and then left. Came to BYU where I was the assistant to the president and general counsel. And I had been here 4 or 5 months or so when I got a phone call asking if I would allow my name to be considered as a federal appeals court judge. And got permission of the powers that be here, and so my name was in the mix. I was not nominated at that time. I was several years later. The next year, had been at BYU maybe 2 years at this point in time, when I got permission to interview for a position as deputy counsel to the president, the deputy White House counsel. Didn't get the job, but the point I'm giving to you is that I've been on the move a lot. Had been here 5 years when finally I was nominated and then appointed to the D.C. Circuit, and so. My resume does have a certain staccato quality about it. It's done now. This is a lifetime appointment. You know, I'm 57 years old, and I'm at my final job, and happy to be there. Let me share with you some advice, okay? And then I'll stop and let you ask questions. If you don't have questions, I'll give you some more advice, okay? The first bit of advice to you is probably the most important that I found in my career, and that's to be nice to people. Now you may think that you're back in the CTRA or B class right now, but it's true to be nice to people. The reason we should be nice to people is because the Lord tells us to be nice to people, right? But let's imagine for a second that you don't care what the Lord says. I hope you're not in that situation, but let's imagine you don't care what the Lord says, and your only goal in life is to get ahead, okay? To get position or prestige or money, and that's the only goal you have. And I know that's not true for anyone, but just hypothetically, let's just imagine that's the case. If that was your number one goal in life, was to get ahead, my advice to you would be nice to people. You never know who the person you're dealing with now is going to be, okay? And you're never going to know, you never know how they might be able to help you. And so be nice to people because it's the right thing to do, even if you don't care about the right thing to do. Be nice to people. It's critically important. It stands out over time. It's so rare to deal with people who are civil and kind and nice to people. Now, just to reclaim the moral high ground on this for a second, here's why we ought to be nice to people. And in a BYU setting, we can discuss this where other places maybe we wouldn't be able to. C.S. Lewis, in his I think his greatest sermon, the essay, The Weight of Glory, says near the end of it this phrase, which I like. He says, next to the blessed sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. The holiest thing that you and I are ever going to meet, other than the emblems of the sacrament, is our neighbor. Act that way. If you do so, I can't promise you you'll get ahead. You might, but your journey along the way is going to be a lot more pleasant than would otherwise be. So that's my first bit of advice. The second bit of advice is to pay attention to detail. Pay meticulous attention to detail. Almost no one else does. And if you do, you will separate yourself from the pack. The biggest mistakes I have made in my career, and I have made some huge mistakes in my career, all came when I tried to cut corners. And you know why I tried to cut corners? Because I was embarrassed to let my supervisor know that I needed more time, that it didn't come quickly to me, that I didn't have the answer on the tip of my tongue, that I actually had to sit down and think it through and ponder it through. I was too embarrassed. I assumed that everyone else had the answer quickly, and I was embarrassed to say, well, I don't have the answer. I need some more time with it. And so when the embarrassment of that was presented, when I was embarrassed with that, I would cut a corner and try and get to the answer. And you know what? Sometimes I got lucky and got the right answer, but the really big mistakes I made all came when I did that. On the other hand, the good things that I've done in my career, and I have done some really, really good things, have all come when I took the extra time, when I swallowed my pride, was no longer trying to appear as the one to whom it came easily or quickly, and did the hard work to get the right answer. And it is hard work, and it takes time, takes lots of time. But the really, really good things that I've done all share that in common. Pay attention to details. Don't skimp. Next one, and then I'm going to pause and we'll see if you have any questions. The next one is you need to learn how to write and to speak clearly. Now, let me tell you a story about that. I'm no longer a lawyer, but I was the first lawyer in my family. I didn't really know any lawyers growing up. The really first lawyers I had any intimate contact with were my law school professors. And I really couldn't understand much of what they were saying. But I knew they were brilliant. They really were. They were just absolutely brilliant people. But I found myself in my classes really struggling to understand what they were talking about. The first time I ever set foot in any courtroom was the Supreme Court of the United States, and I was the guest of Rex Lee, the former president of the university, founding dean of the law school. He was the Solicitor General of the United States. That's the government's lawyer in the Supreme Court, to put a short phrase. It's, in my view, the best job that any lawyer could ever have, advocating for the position of the United States before the Supreme Court. And Rex had that job. Through a strange combination of events, I ended up being his guest. He lived in my ward, and he invited me to be his guest at an oral argument. And so I was there as the guest of the Solicitor General of the United States. It's pretty heady stuff for a law student. And I'll never forget the day. I didn't really know much about the case that he was arguing, but I remember the first lawyer to get up and speak was his opponent and happened to be a law school professor. And this guy was brilliant. I mean, it was stunning how articulate he was and how brilliant he was. And I thought, oh my gosh, this guy is really good. And the reason that I knew that he was brilliant and articulate was because he was just like my law school professors who were brilliant and articulate. And I knew they were brilliant and articulate because I couldn't understand anything they were saying. But I knew that they were really brilliant. I knew I was in the presence of greatness, but I didn't understand. Then Rex Lee got up to speak, and I was mortified. I was so embarrassed for him. I mean, this was the great Rex Lee arguing in front of the Supreme Court with his morning suit on and, and the tails and everything. And I was so embarrassed for him. I kept thinking, this sounds like we're in a gospel doctrine class. This sounds like he's teaching Sunday school. I mean, the next thing I expect him to do is wheel out, a chalkboard and do a diagram. I was so embarrassed because I could understand everything he was saying. It was clear, and I could understand it. Well, you get the point. Rex Lee was considered by many, and rightly so, one of the greatest advocates before the Supreme Court in the history of the United States. And the reason was because he could take a very complex argument and make it sound like Sunday school. And at the time, not knowing anything, I thought, oh, that's embarrassing. And now, sitting on the other side of that bench, that's genius. And you know what? You are uniquely prepared to write and communicate clearly. Why? Because you teach kids in primary. No, and I'm not, listen, that is no small thing. You have the task of taking powerful and complex ideas, reducing them to their elements and communicating them clearly. That is a remarkable and much needed skill. Get better at it. Learn how to write and to think clearly. If you do that, you'll be very effective in whatever you choose to do. Okay, I'm going to pause right here and see if you have any questions, and I hope you do. And if you don't have any questions, I'll keep going with my sermonette. But any questions so far about anything that I've said? Yes, thank you. Rescue me.
Just a second, let's get that.
Oh, we got a microphone coming here.
Over here.
You said that being able to write clearly is a skill that we should all have. How did you develop that skill? Because I hear a lot of people tell us to do that, but not really point us in any directions.
Well, I'm not certain I've developed it. I'm working at it, but I work hard at it. But from what I can tell, the best writers are people who read a lot. They read a lot because they read good writers a lot. I'm not talking about reading popular periodicals and blogs. I read blogs, but no, I'm talking about reading, Stegner, Tolstoy, Shakespeare. I mean, they immerse themselves in that because good reading, reading of good writing creates, as far as I can tell, this little inner voice in here. And when you're writing, you write to that voice, right? I mean, yeah, there are all the rules of grammar and stuff that we ought to know that I don't really know. But when I write, I hear it inside, and it either sounds right or it doesn't sound right. And as far as I can tell, that's a skill that can be developed, but it can be developed best by people who read a lot. And then you read a lot, and then you write a lot. You write. There are all these great sayings about it, right? There's no such thing as good writing. It's just good rewriting, right? It takes time and effort. And when I was an undergraduate, I did very well here. I can't remember working on too many papers that were second drafts. Maybe you do. Times have changed. Maybe you do. Right now, as I mentioned, in writing judicial opinions, it's unimaginable to me that we would publish anything from our chambers that hadn't gone through at least 5 drafts. We had an opinion last term that was 30 drafts. Now, that was a little ridiculous, The marginal value between the 29th and 30th draft probably didn't justify the time spent. But you get the idea. Here's the bad news about this. It takes time. But the good news is, if you spend time at it, you can get better at it. So read a lot, write a lot. I don't know any, how do you get good at being a quarterback? I don't want to wade into a controversy here or anything, but how do you get good at it? You practice it, right? You practice it. So, yeah, okay, okay. Somebody asked me how you get to be a judge, but anyway, go ahead. I should have put that in here, so go ahead.
One quick question.
Sure.
More serious question. I've heard that a lot of the Supreme Court justices are using new forms of technology to foster to quicken their reading or to make it more easy. And I wonder if you use a Kindle or an iPad. And then more seriously, how is your?
Yeah, I use an iPad, but it doesn't quicken my reading at all. I mean, we download the briefs on my iPad so I can read the briefs more easily.
It's more convenient.
But yeah, more convenient.
Okay. And
it saves the shipping cost of sending stuff from my chambers to my home in Provo, and that's about all it. So.
How has your religion played into? Has it ever come up where people have mistrusted you because you're LDS?
So that's an interesting question. I thought you were going to go somewhere different with that, and so I'll answer your question, but then I'll answer the one I thought you were going to ask. Okay. I don't know. Have people I really don't know if people have distrusted me because of my religion. My sense has been, and who knows? I mean, I engage in self-deception as well as anyone, so maybe I'm wrong. But my sense has been that people have actually thought better of me than maybe they should have when they learned that I was a Latter-day Saint. I've always felt that it was actually quite a benefit to me. And again, most of my legal career was spent in Washington, D.C., and for Latter-day Saint attorneys in Washington, D.C. of a certain generation, I'll use the name Rex Lee again, we benefited from the remarkable reputation of a remarkable human being, Rex Lee. And when people found out that we had even the most tangential connection to Rex Lee, they transferred all the goodwill that he had built up onto us, and we benefited from it. So if what you're getting at is, have I ever felt that I've been the victim of some bias or discrimination because I'm a Latter-day Saint? None that I'm aware of. Now, who knows, behind my back what people are, who knows? I must say that, in 2008, when Governor Romney was getting all the attention he was, I started to feel a little bit uncomfortable because I thought, well, maybe all these people who are so nice to me behind my back think I'm some religious fanatic or kook. But if they do think that, they've never been so brash as to confront me with it. And I actually think it's worked more to my benefit. And not that I view it that way. Not that I view it as I can get from here to here by being an active Mormon. I actually don't think of it that way. But I never thought it was a liability. Now, here's the question I thought you were going to ask, and I frequently get this. So what role does religion play in your job, in your job as a judge? And the answer to that's fairly simple. In terms of my approach to a case and to the disposition of a case, none. Absolutely none. And if it played any, I think I would be doing something gravely wrong. Gravely wrong. Now, see, I got your attention because some people, that's a surprise. See, because I took an oath to become a judge, a federal judge. A couple things have to happen. You have to be nominated by the President of the United States. You have to be confirmed by a majority vote of the United States Senate, and then you have to be appointed by the President after that. He doesn't have. Once the Senate confirms you, the President doesn't have to appoint you. They've just given their advice and consent to the appointment. Then the President appoints you, but then the last thing that has to happen is you have to take an oath. You cannot enter in, you can't get paid, you can't enter into your duties as a judge until you take an oath, and that oath is to the Constitution and the laws of the United States. And so my job as a judge is to do the best I can to figure out what is the law here? What is the value choice that the American people have made through their elected representatives and enshrined in the Constitution or the laws? That's it's really a very clerical sort of job in the sense of you're just trying to do research to figure out what the law is. You're not sitting there to figure out what's the right result, what's the just thing to do, what's the fair thing to do. That's not the role of a judge, at least in our system. The role of a judge in our system is to figure out what is the value choice the American people have made and put into law, and then use that to resolve the dispute in front of you. And so, in that instance, I have lots of views about what's right and wrong and fair and just, and I do my best to keep those completely out of the decision-making process. Now, hopefully my religion plays a role in my motivation to do a good job, right? And to get up each morning and to give my best effort and stuff like that. But in terms of anything beyond that, I do everything I can to keep my particular worldview and religious worldview out of the decision-making process. And I feel that if I did otherwise, I would actually be violating my oath, right? And so one more story about that. So I was in my office at the administration building at BYU in June of 2005 when the Senate confirmed me, and it was a happy day. It was actually later that day or the next day. I was the recipient of many congratulatory phone calls. It was really nice, and one came from a former law partner of mine, whose judgment I've valued over the years, and he said, "Congratulations, Tom. Can I give you some advice?" He said, "I used to clerk for Judge X." You'll see why I'm not naming this judge at the end of the story. For Judge X on the D.C. Circuit, and after that, I clerked for Judge Y on the United States Supreme Court, and I've followed judges carefully over the years, and so can I give you some advice? And I said, man, I am teachable right now. Please give me advice. And he said, I remember the day, my first day in the chambers of Judge X on your court, on the D.C. Circuit. The judge brought us law clerks in and sat us down and said, here is our job. Here is what we do. The first thing that we do is we learn the facts of the case as best we can, because these are real people and our decision is going to have an impact on their life. So they deserve that we learn as much we can about the facts of their case. The second thing that we do is we think long and hard and deep about what's the fair result. What's the just thing to do here? What's the equitable disposition of this case? And then once we figured out what that is, we go find law to support our decision. Well, the purpose of his conversation, of his advice, was not to engage me in a discussion about the role of a judge under the Constitution. I thanked him for his advice. As I hung up the phone, I took a vow that I would always listen to the first part of his advice and never, ever do the second. That I would never come at a case trying to decide what I thought was the fair result. That I would never do that. Instead, I would always look to what the law requires of that. And so now when my law clerks come in the very first day, that's the very first thing they hear. The very first story they hear is that story. And I say, look, your job is to make certain that my dispositions, that my judgments are never influenced by what Tom Griffith thinks is right or fair or just. Because our job is to figure out what the American people think is right and fair and just and have enacted into law. And I'm their servant. We're their servants. And so we take their values and use them to resolve the case. And then I hand them my oath of office. And they all have to read through the oath. And I tell them, your job is to make certain I abide that oath. Because if I don't, quoting from A Man for All Seasons, what is an oath but words we speak to God? And we get a little bit dramatic about this. I say, and if I violate that oath, I am going to be sent to hell. Okay? And I don't want to be. So your job is to keep me from being sent to hell. So anyway, that's the question I wanted you to ask me. As you can see, I get quite impassioned about that. Brigham.
So that's like a noble ideal, and that makes sense for like hearing that. I was wondering how that actually works when you're dealing with a case and there's ambiguities in the law and there's precedents on both sides and there's hyperbolic arguments of how the world's going to be destroyed if you went one way or went the other way. And you know, in courts, it's not always unanimous.
I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's easy. And that's why we work hard and hopefully get qualified people with good training and good critical reasoning skills, and that's why you have law clerks spend a lot of time on it. All I'm saying is that's got to be the objective, right? You've got to look for that. Now, as Brigham points out, the most cursory study of the history of the Supreme Court and of the federal judiciary would lead one to believe that maybe that hasn't been the hunt for all judges in all times, right? And obviously that's got to be the case. But that's got to be, in my view, if judges don't adopt that view, I think they pose a serious threat to our democracy. Look, I don't know how much time you have to do this, but just yesterday, Justice Scalia and Justice Breyer testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee on the role of judges in our federal judiciary. It takes 2.5 hours. I know that's a little bit, it's a bit long, but you really ought to go onto the C-SPAN website and watch. I haven't watched all of it. I've just seen clips of it. But it's just this wonderful interaction with the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee about this very issue. And both Justice Breyer and Justice Scalia, who disagree on many things, agreed on this one thing, and that is judges are an anomaly in our system, right? Because the most foundational idea behind our republic is that we, the people, get to make the rules by which society is ordered and governed. And the way they do that is through politics, right? Through elections, through elected representatives. You know, you support candidate X because she thinks the law ought to be Y. You support candidate B because he thinks that the law ought to be Z. And you have this great clash of ideas and debates and contests and elections, and somebody wins and they get to set the rules, and that's how we govern our society, right? Remember back in high school civics, the How a Bill Becomes a Law, that little cartoon? We all had it at various stages, little cartoon drawings of how a bill becomes law. As far, I probably ought to look back and check that cartoon out before I say this, but I don't remember there being a judge anywhere in that. Judges aren't supposed to make the rules by which our society is governed because we have lifetime appointment. We are not politically accountable. You can't recall us. We're an anomaly. And so we have this very unique position of being unelected and having lifetime tenure, which is counter-democratic, right? And so there's a real, so if we allowed judges who are unrepresentative to start making the laws, the system is akimbo, the system's skewed. The system is supposed to be that you make the laws, and then when somebody has a dispute about what the law means and how it governs a certain set of circumstances, you bring it to neutral judges who are supposed to be dispassionate, and we're supposed to look and find out what the law is and apply that. That's all we're supposed to do. Our position is really should be a very modest one. And so when judges abandon that role and decide that they're going to use their own sense of what's right and wrong, that undermines the system in a most fundamental way. Has that been done? Sure, people are human. We make mistakes, but just the fact that those mistakes have been made doesn't justify them, and I don't think gives judges the license to abandon the role that the Constitution has confined us to. So, okay. Yes, ma'am.
I agree with you completely on what you just said, and
Thank you.
That's precisely why I don't know what to make of what happened to Troy Davis, and I'm not sure if it's just because one side really had more people or if it was just a louder side, but it seemed like what I gather from most news that I read was that most people wanted him to be set free, like not get executed, but the Supreme Court ruled otherwise.
Yeah.
So
you know, I don't know anything more about the Troy Davis case than headlines, and so that's something I really can't comment on. Of course, the other side of it is, if I did know a lot about that case, I wouldn't be able to comment on it either. So, but I will plead ignorance on this one. Mr. Evans.
Can you talk a little about what the clerks do for you most of the time? Are you establishing? They're looking at cases. They're looking at background on.
Right. So what the question is, what do your law clerks do? Well, the first thing is they work really hard. So right now it's 4:40 here in Provo. It's 6:40 in Washington, D.C., and I take great pleasure in knowing they're all there right now while I'm speaking, and they all have assignments and they're working. It's just a great feeling. I tell them what most judges tell them. I say, look, I'm running a marathon. You're a sprinter. Okay, sprint. So first things, they work long hours. What do they do? Well, they help me in all the things that I'm supposed to do. They have two primary tasks. They help me prepare for the cases I'm going to hear. And here's how that works. So the case that I hear, the lawyers come before us. One side has maybe 15 minutes. The other side has 15 minutes. I hear that case with my colleagues for a half an hour. We then go back and discuss it and make a decision. That's over, right? Half an hour. What a great job, you know. Well, but prior to that half an hour, there are weeks and weeks and weeks of work that have gone into it. So what happens is a case will be scheduled before us. and we'll get the materials on the case several months in advance. The materials come in the form of what are called briefs. Each side makes written arguments about their case. Those come into my chambers, and they look like they're stacked like this, and they don't come to me first, okay? They go to my law clerks first. And their job is to read every single word and look at every single authority that's cited in every single page of every single brief, and to master it, And they will spend a couple of weeks doing that for each case. And what they do is they distill that information into a briefing binder for me. And I will typically spend 12 hours preparing for each case that I'm going to hear. But they have spent weeks, 80 hours, 90 hours beyond in that case. And so their task is to do like what Rex Lee did, take complex material and dumb it down for the judge. And then they tell me what to read and what not to read. So I get the very essence of it. So that's what they do. And then once I get the assignment to write an opinion, not all judges do this, although I think most do, I will discuss the opinion with the law clerk. We'll come up with an outline of the opinion. I'll sign off on the outline, and then it's up to my law clerks to come up with the first draft. There are still some, judges don't talk about this a lot because this is sort of the tricks of the trade sort of thing. But the sense that I get is that most judges do what I do and have the law clerks come up with the first draft of the opinion. And then I take it from there, and we go back and forth together over the next 5 to 20 drafts or so. So that's what they do. Most of them report that it's a great job. You're working in close quarters with 5 people, the judge and 4 law clerks. It's collaborative. Some of our cases are not interesting, but a lot of them are very interesting. For example, the Supreme Court is going to be looking at 2 of the cases that we were involved in the last couple of years. One of them you've probably heard about because it's getting a lot of attention. It's the case where the Metropolitan Police in Washington, D.C. attached a GPS tracking device to a car and then kept the information on it for the next month or so. They found out that the fellow who owned the car was a drug dealer. They arrested him, convicted him. He was convicted, but he challenged his convictions on the grounds that the police should have a search warrant as required under the Fourth Amendment before they can put a GPS tracking device on an automobile. And I was on the panel. I did not write the opinion on that, but I was on the panel that decided for the first federal court to do this, that no, the Fourth Amendment requires that before the police can conduct that type of activity. So now the Supreme Court has taken that case, which is never a good sign, because I think the figures are something like 60 to 70% of the cases they take them because they think they were wrong and they're going to overturn you. So, but anyway, that's the type of thing that we get to do. We have another case that the court is, hello, Paul, that the court is considering that's a little more technical than that. But it's interesting because of that. And so there's lots of discussion amongst the clerks. I tell them a little exaggeration, but my happiest moment. No, my happiest moment was when Johnny Harleen caught the pass from John Beck. That was the happiest moment. But a happy moment is when I go out from my chambers and I go back to where the clerks are working and I see them in each other's office arguing about things. And so if you like to argue, that clash of ideas, it's a great job. And it's so much better than being at a law firm, because at a law firm you've got that clock running constantly and you're always thinking about how much time is this costing somebody. We don't have that. We have the luxury of spending as much time as we need to get it right. And I got to tell you, that is a wonderful. I've never had that in any job before this one, and there's a real satisfaction about that. You wanted a follow-up question.
So do you feel like a clerkship, federal or otherwise, is useful regardless of the branch of law you're doing?
No, I don't think it's useful completely. For example, if someone, well, it's useful in the sense that any interesting experience in life is useful. But if someone wants to be a lawyer and their real goal in life is to do what's referred to as transactional work, where you're going to be helping businesses do deals with one another, it's hard for me to see how the clerkship experience translates into that, other than the fact that it's, you know, interesting year spent with interesting people. The primary benefit of having a clerkship, as I can see it, is if one wants to go into law and to be in the litigation side of things, where you want to be someone who actually goes into court and makes makes arguments. And if you're one of those folks, if you're inclined that way, you'll probably want to clerk for a district court judge if you see yourself as being the type of person who's actually going to try cases in front of juries. If, on the other hand, you see yourself as being an appellate lawyer, you know, like John Roberts or something, then a clerkship at an appeals court would be beneficial. If you want to teach at a law school, increasingly in the last 20 years or so, a federal appellate clerkship has by many law schools has been sort of almost demanded of folks, not universally, but demanded of folks. So a lot of my law clerks have that interest in mind. You can tell that what they'd really like to end up doing someday is being a professor somewhere teaching, and so. Sorry. Yeah, no.
Sneak in with a question, actually, because it's relevant to all of them as well, but it's also relevant to all the students who come to me and say, well, I'm thinking of going to law school, right? And I say, immediately my first reaction is, well, Judge Griffith's job sounds fascinating, but I've heard of lots of lawyers whose jobs don't sound very interesting to me. And you also hear a lot these days about law schools churning out too many lawyers with too much debt. And
Are we having an earthquake?
I'm not sure.
We had one in Washington recently. So
no, there's a strange shaking going on occasionally around here.
Okay.
But anyway, so I'm wondering if you can help me. You know, how to advise these folks, right? Is law school right for me? Right? Just kind of a general question. Because I have, you know, I tend to try to throw cold water on it. I tend to say, well, I know, I've heard of lots of unhappy lawyers, and I hear lots of...
Well, I think that's true. I mean, you know, there's lots of social science data that suggests that a disproportionate number of American lawyers are dissatisfied. And I don't know how to respond to that, because it's so subjective. It really depends on what your interests are. There does seem to be a significant correlation between unhappiness in lawyers and whether they are in government or public service or whether they're with private law firms. Now, I've done the government thing. I was a partner at a major law firm in Washington, D.C. And just from my sensibilities, and they may not be yours, from my sensibilities, I loved working in the Senate. I mean, I really, and I'm not kidding. That was I was 40 years old when I got that job. That was the first time. Now, I graduated from law school when I was a little older. I was 31. So I had been practicing law for 9 years, become the legal counsel of the United States Senate. That was the first time when I could not wait to get to work each day. I loved it. And I'd been through the law firm route and been made partner at the law firm, and it was okay. It was okay. But the feeling that I had, and it just may be me, the feeling that I had when I would go to work each day at the law firm, and I worked with wonderful people and actually had some good cases to work on, but I kept thinking, by the sweat of your brow shall you eat bread all the days of your life. I really felt like this is a curse, you know. How come my parents didn't have money, you know? Why don't I have a trust fund? Why do I have to do this? And at least for me, when I did the government stuff, the money is nowhere. You don't make any money. It's bad. You don't make any money. But I really loved what I was doing. Now, you ought to know I have no money, right? I mean, so I have lots of friends who went law firm route, and they're set financially. You just look at my financial disclosure reports, and and there are things that my family didn't have and didn't enjoy that maybe some of your families have, and maybe you want your kids to enjoy. But I went the route. As my wife said, my husband's never met a pay cut that he didn't like. You know, but I went the route where I was a partner at a very prosperous law firm. I was there 1 year after I made partner, and I bailed. And I worked for the government. That wasn't great. I worked for BYU. That was even less. You know, and now I'm a judge, which is a great job, but the pay isn't spectacular. It's not bad. It's okay. It's not spectacular. So it's a very subjective thing. But I think, from my observation, it's the lawyers who are working in government, public service, who seem to enjoy their jobs a little bit more. And that, I painted that with an awfully broad brush, and I can think of plenty of exceptions to that. But
And how does that break down percentage-wise?
you know, that I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think the overwhelming majority of lawyers are in the private sector, right? I mean, so. Any other questions? Yes.
I guess this could kind of be seen as a follow-up.
Wait for that mic.
Oh, sorry.
I guess this would kind of be seen as a follow-up to the question just answered, but I'm wondering, for you as a student personally, I'm sure it was a pretty big decision to leave law school. What motivated you to want to come back 5 years later?
Oh, that's a good question. So I quit and came back. Well, I tell you why I quit, because I was really terrified. My classmates just intimidated me to death. I mean, I went to BYU, and I did really, really well here. I mean, I had great grades. I was valedictorian in my college, and I had a lot of self-confidence. I went to the University of Virginia Law School, and I felt completely overwhelmed by my classmates, most of whom who had gone to Ivy League schools and had done well there. And I just thought, oh, I can't keep. And so, truth be known, I didn't think of it that way at the time, but in hindsight, I chickened out. I just chickened out. So I went to the church educational system and loved that. But I decided that wasn't, I didn't want to be giving lessons on necking and petting when I was 40 years old. I just thought there's a time and a season for that. Of course, then when I was 40, I was a bishop, and that's what I'm doing, right? But I just thought I want to do something else, and so I thought I'll go back to law school. I mean, what I really wanted to do. So I was at Yale Law School a year or so ago, and was doing this question and answer, and somebody asked me if this was the job that I really always wanted, to be a lawyer and to be a judge. And I said, actually not. It's really the job. The job I really wanted growing up. I really wanted to be a minister. I was an Episcopalian. And that's what man, if we had a paid ministry, that's where I'd be. That's my first choice. But daggone it, there really were gold plates. And so that sort of limited my options that way. So this is clearly a second choice way below that. But for somebody who's majored in humanities and comparative literature, there weren't too many options. And I'm overstating that a little bit. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and my heroes were politicians who happened to be lawyers. And so I thought, well, so I went back again and did fine. Guess what I found out? I found out that if you're serious about it, the undergraduate education you get here, if you're serious about it, can match the undergraduate education of any place in the country. Now, if you are not serious about it, you're going to get blown away. Because there are lots of places that are a lot tougher. When I'm saying serious about it, if you have a self-imposed discipline so that you want to be really good, you've got, look at here, Darren Hawkins, Paul Carey. You don't get people like this just anywhere. And if you learn from them and work really hard at it, you're going to get as fine an undergraduate education as you can. But if you go along with the crowd, you're not. Look, it doesn't cut it compared to a lot of other places. But anyway, but I didn't go along with the crowd, and I worked real hard here, and I found out, oh, I can handle it. So anyway, any other questions? Okay, well, I have a point. No, hold on, don't clap. I have a point. So here's my final bit of advice. And I know we're out of time, and if you need to go, go. But my final bit of advice is to build the kingdom. That's what we're supposed to be doing with our careers and our jobs. And the challenge is to figure out to align your life's work in some way with the atonement of Christ. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to go be a social worker, although that's something maybe you ought to think about more than you have. I think you can align yourself with the atonement on Wall Street, right? If your motivation is that you really want to build the kingdom and help people. Now, this is a game that you can easily engage in self-deception, right? Very easily engage in self-deception. You've got to be really careful about it. But if your goal is to help others, to create wealth not so that you can build a 21,000 square foot home, and if you grew up in a home like that, I'm not going to, that's fine. But so that you can use your talents and skills and create wealth to benefit those who've been pushed to the margins of society. If that's your motive, go for it. I hope you make $1 billion a year if that's your motive, okay? That's got to be our motive, to align ourselves with the atonement of Christ. You figure out how you can do that in your career and then go for it. If you can't figure out how to do that in your career, and by the way, I think being a mob lawyer would be really hard to do that, okay? There are some careers that I think are off limits for us. Some people think lawyers are off limits for us, but I don't think that's the case. So to figure out, to think hard and deep about your life's work in terms of career and in terms of employment, and to see if you can find in your motivation for that work the atonement of Christ, the drawing us to Him, drawing others to one another. If you can figure that out, you're onto something significant. At the end of his life, Thomas More, on the scaffold, about to be beheaded, was asked to give his last words. Does anyone know what they were? A little trivia, except for Paul, Carrie. Any other closet Catholics here? Okay, so Thomas More's last words were, "I die the King's good servant, but God's first." That ought to be ours as well. I die the King's good servant, but God's first. You figure out how to do that in your career, and you'll have a great career, a rewarding career, and you'll be able to do much good. So, with that, I thank you very much.